Susanne Helfrich was one of the first Germans to contract COVID-19. And she was one of the first to see that symptoms can remain even after the virus is gone. 5 months later, she was still experiencing difficulties.
I'm very tired. I can easily go to bed and fall asleep at 8 o'clock. That wasn't the case before. And that's the main problem, the tiredness. It's really debilitating.
Some 10 to 20% of those infected later suffer from long COVID. Recent studies suggest women are at greater risk than men. The lungs, heart, brain, or mental health can be affected. And it is still not exactly clear what causes long COVID or what can be done to treat it. Hello and welcome to your COVID-19 special. I'm Chris Colbert in Berlin. Being tired, out of breath, and feeling like the infection simply won't leave. Long COVID syndrome is grueling for patients and a challenge to medical professionals. Now, researchers in the German city of Erlangen might have taken an important step towards understanding more about the condition.
A single drop of blood is all that's needed for the examination. At the University of Erlangen's Max Planck Institute in Germany, scientists are looking for the causes of long COVID or post-COVID-19 syndrome, in which patients suffer from lingering breathlessness, tightness in the chest, or fatigue.
We've seen many different blood cells react very strongly. They get bigger and have a greater volume. Some become more malleable, others become more rigid. These characteristics might have something to do with the cells not passing through the capillaries as easily and instead getting stuck in the lungs.
To measure the cell's malleability, scientists have developed a so-called chip, which contains tiny holes, finer than a human hair. Blood is pumped through these canals and filmed with a high-speed camera. The result? Healthy blood cells become rod-shaped. Infected ones remain round clumps.
Alone, the finding that all blood cells change is very significant. And what we then saw is that these characteristics revert back to normal in most patients once they've got over the disease and made a full recovery.
The test method from Erlangen provides doctors with yet another tool for better understanding COVID-19 and its long-term effects.
So there is some indication of what could be causing long COVID symptoms, but a lot still needs to be figured out. Let's try to unpack of what is known so far. With me is Matthew Bartels, Professor of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation at Montefiore Medical Center in New York. Welcome back to our program, Matthew. As we just saw in the report, abnormalities in the blood could be a cause of long COVID. Could this finding help in the prevention or even therapy of it?
This is a very interesting finding because, we have not really to this point understood the exact causes of long COVID. And it is a systemic type of disease and it manifests in many ways, as you had in your intro piece. The idea that something that's a blood abnormality may contribute to a systemic disease is not at all something that would be unusual. Many people are familiar with sickle cell, and although that's a genetic condition and very different, having abnormalities of the blood cells there cause many effects, including central neurological symptoms, fatigue, cause musculoskeletal complaints, problems with the joints. So having something that is present all throughout the body, like the blood, showing these long-term abnormalities may be a very important step in understanding part of where we may be getting the causes of our long COVID.
10 to 20% of COVID patients end up suffering from long COVID symptoms like fatigue, shortness of breath, headache. How long do those usually last?
Well, that's a very good point. We don't really know. We are, at this point, only a year and a half into the pandemic, but we are seeing in our own medical center, and we have a long COVID clinic, numerous patients that a year out are still seeing symptoms. The fatigue seems to be one of the greatest ones. There are, of course, patients who have long-term lung damage that have come from having had the COVID, and that causes scarring that we don't know if it's going to reverse, but it seems in very severe cases, unfortunately, that it persists, and we're now starting to be concerned that that may actually progress to the point where patients may actually require lung transplantation as the disease progresses. And the neurologic symptoms, many patients complain of a fogginess or a little bit of mental clouding that persists for a long time. We don't know exactly what the causes of these things are, but we do know that exercise and that having patients participate in our therapy programs, the rehabilitation things that we would do for patients who have other causes of either neurologic or pulmonary or chronic fatigue or musculoskeletal symptoms do seem to have effect as well for this population. So we're having benefit and we're actually making them feel better, but we still have a problem with not understanding fully the long-term time course because it's just too early for us to know the long-term effects.
Okay, we know that high age, being overweight, and other symptoms add to the risk of a severe COVID infection. Do these conditions also contribute to the risk of long COVID?
It appears that the folks who had higher risk for having COVID seem to have more symptoms, but it's not just only those patients. We have young, otherwise active and healthy patients who are presenting with long COVID symptoms. And so it's a pretty broad spread. But it does seem to be that the very severe patients seem to have more of the pulmonary and cardiac symptoms that persist, whereas we're very surprised to see a lot of patients who were never admitted to hospital and who were never in an intensive care unit or on a breathing machine who are presenting now with long COVID. So they had a relatively mild initial course, but are still presenting with the fatigue and some of the mental clouding. And that is very interesting and kind of concerning because we don't necessarily have a handle to say, oh, you are definitely going to be free of this, because it happens to everyone.
Is the fact that we've just, quote unquote, just been 1.5 years into this pandemic, does this fact make it so difficult to do proper research on long COVID?
Well, the research, there's some things that are progressing rapidly. And because so many individuals have had long COVID, this is a disease, and have had COVID, we're actually getting a much better categorization of for the long-term sequelae or the long-term side effects of this condition. It's difficult for us to actually tell because we don't have the long-term yet. So, we don't know yet to say what will happen to people 5, 10, 15 years from now. But the other challenge that we have is a lot of the symptoms of long COVID overlap with symptoms that we can see from other kinds of syndromes, such as chronic fatigue syndrome, or from mild dementias, or from other kinds of metabolic conditions that may cause some brain abnormalities, which cause people to have some confusion. And then as you resolve those underlying metabolic conditions, you can resolve the underlying problem. So we really, at this point, are looking at such a constellation of so many symptoms that it makes it a little hard to focus in, because it's not like long COVID is just causing one thing. It causes a whole constellation of symptoms, which may actually be either enhanced or worsened by other conditions, or may just be the other condition and we're thinking it may be long COVID. So it's a bit challenging for researchers to actually get it tied up in a tight bundle, because we have so many complexities that are actually in there. But the knowledge that we're getting now is moving forward. And for example, the blood study that you just mentioned is one of these things where we're now starting to see the physiologic background.
Right. Matthew Bartels, Professor of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation. Thank you for your thoughts.
Thank you.
And from the feeling that COVID never left, it's now on to the worry of catching it again. Here's one of your questions for our science correspondent, Derek Williams.
I had COVID-19 recently and recovered. Then, not long ago, found out I was exposed again. Could I have been infected again?
The data we have indicates that although it's not impossible, it's highly unlikely. A lot of researchers have looked at this question and come to that conclusion. For instance, a recent large-scale study involving over 25,000 healthcare workers in Britain showed that having had COVID-19 once had a dramatic protective effect for at least 7 months after an infection. The strength of the effect was close to the one observed in people who've had 2 doses of our most effective vaccines. Additionally, the study showed that in people who had COVID-19, then tested positive again for it a few months or weeks after convalescence, the chances of developing symptoms were also much lower than in those who were infected for the first time. But if you had the disease and recovered, it still doesn't mean that you can just sit back and relax completely. You still really need to follow it up with vaccination. That's because although recent studies into the robustness of long-term immune response in people who got the disease, although they've been very encouraging, we still don't know whether that response might wane over time. In fact, a growing body of research now indicates that people who recovered and were subsequently vaccinated, that they could very well have the best protection of all. Some experts believe the immune response after that double whammy will be so powerful and so long-lasting in those who've recovered and been vaccinated that they might never need future booster shots. But for those of us who've only been vaccinated, a lot of experts expect a booster shot will be necessary at some point down the line.
And that's all for this edition of COVID-19 Special. For more information about the pandemic, you can check out the COVID-19 section on our website at dw.com. For now, thanks for watching. Take care.